I remember the first time I saw Robert. It was in college. He was sitting alone in the library, buried in a book, lost in his thoughts. And from that very second, I wanted to make love to him. I was 22 and he was 24. Robert had just come out of a messy relationship, or so I heard from others. They said he was heartbroken, not looking for anything serious. But something about him drew me in, something in those sad brown eyes. I needed his help with a few things, so I made the first move. At first, it was just friendship, or at least that's what I made him think. But deep down, I knew there was something more. So one day, I walked into his room wearing a revealing gown that showed off everything. I had paid his roommate's stay away. I walked in with a half-empty bottle of whiskey. I knew it was going to be a wild night, and I was ready for it. Robert looked up from his book as I entered, his eyes widening at the sight of me. I could see the surprise and desire flash across his face as he took in the way the gown clung to my curves, the way the soft fabric draped over my body, leaving little to the imagination. I walked over to him slowly, letting him feel the weight of the moment, letting him understand what was about to happen. I handed him the bottle, and as he took a sip, his hands trembled slightly. I smiled, a slow, deliberate smile, knowing he was already under my spell. I took the bottle from his hand and set it on the bedside table, then leaned in close, my lips brushing against his ear as I whispered, "Tonight is just you and me." I could feel his breath quicken, his body tense with anticipation. I ran my fingers down his chest, feeling the heat of his skin through his shirt. I could tell he was holding back, unsure of how far this would go. But I wasn't. I wanted to make him mine, to take him to a place he'd never been before. I pressed my lips to his, soft at first, teasing, before deepening the kiss, letting my tongue explore his mouth, tasting the whiskey on his breath. Robert's hands found their way to my waist, pulling me closer, and I felt a shiver of excitement run down my spine. I let out a soft moan as his hands moved up my back, pulling at the ties of my gown until it slipped off my shoulders and pulled around my feet. I was standing there, bare before him, and I could see the hunger in his eyes. I pushed him back onto the bed, climbing on top of him, and for a moment we just looked at each other, the air between us thick with desire. Then, without a word, I lowered myself onto him, and together we fell into a rhythm, our bodies moving as one, each touch, each kiss, igniting a fire that consumed us both. Robert wanted us to be official, to put a label on whatever we had, but I couldn't do it. I told him about my past engagement, how it had failed, how it had broken me. But deep down, I knew that wasn't the real reason. I liked the power I had over him, the way he kept wanting more while I kept pulling away. Robert was so sweet, so kind. He was everything I should have wanted. But something inside me didn't want to let him have that. I'd make little comments, comparing him to my exes, picking at small things until they grew into arguments. I could see the confusion in his eyes, the way he started to doubt himself. But I didn't stop. I knew what I was doing, but I didn't care. There were good times too, times when everything seemed perfect. We'd laugh, we'd kiss, and it felt like we were the only two people in the world. But those moments never lasted. I remember once we were playfully arguing and I slapped him. Twice. It was a joke, to me at least, but I saw the hurt in his eyes. I told him I didn't need him, that there were other guys in the complex who were interested in me. I thought it was funny. He didn't. But he stayed. He always stayed. At After more than a year of this back and forth, I finally agreed to be his girlfriend. Robert was so happy, like a child on Christmas morning, but nothing really changed. I kept our relationship hidden from everyone except my family. He thought it was strange, but he ignored it. He ignored a lot of things. We broke up and got back together more times than I can count. We both had our issues, our own struggles, but we kept coming back to each other. We talked about marriage, about a future together, even when we knew we were only fooling ourselves. I moved around a lot during this time, trying to find something I couldn't even name. Robert noticed the distance, the way I stopped calling as often, the way I expected him to drop everything to answer me when I did. When he suggested we get engaged, I pulled away again, told him I wanted something more casual. He was hurt, confused, but he agreed. He always agreed to whatever I wanted. I started seeing other people just to satisfy my wild desires. The first was Collins, a guy who worked in campus security. Collins had a roughness about him that both frightened and thrilled me. We met in secret, in the dark corner of an old unused classroom. His hands were firm, almost aggressive, as he explored my body, and I let him take control. The way he touched me was raw, and I could feel the heat between us rising. I was drawn to the danger of it all, the feeling of being wanted, even if it was just for that moment. As our bodies intertwined, I felt a rush of emotions that I couldn't quite name. A blend of pleasure and a deep and settling emptiness that I tried to ignore. The room was filled with our breaths, heavy and fast. Collins didn't speak much, he let his actions do the talking. His kisses were forceful, and I found myself giving in to him completely, losing myself in the intensity of it all. Every touch, every movement was driven by a need to escape, to forget everything that was wrong in my life, even if just for a little while. I clung to him, searching for something real, something that would make me feel alive, but all I found was a fleeting moment of satisfaction. When it was over, we lay there in silence, both knowing that this was nothing more than a temporary release. As I got dressed, I realized the emptiness was still there, deeper now, but I pushed it aside. This was just the beginning after all. Collins was the first of many. They always ended up treating me like trash. But then I was only in it for the sex. I still kept Robert around. I'd tell him about my dates, how they didn't compare to him. He was better than all of them, I said. It made him stay, even when he knew he shouldn't. His friends and family told him to leave, to save himself from the pain I was causing him. But he didn't listen. He confronted me once, tried to end things, but I wouldn't let him. I pulled him back in like I always did. I became meaner, crueler. I told him things that cut him deep, things I knew would hurt. I told him I'd never tell him if I got pregnant, that I'd make decisions about the child without him. He wanted to be a father so badly, and I used that against him. But still, we'd make up, and the cycle would start all over again. It was around Christmas, while Robert was visiting his brother in Florida, that things finally started to unravel. I guess his brother talked sense into his head. When he came back, I noticed he seemed stronger. My mind games no longer had their effect on him. I panicked and told him I didn't want to date anymore. Robert agreed, and I could see the relief in his eyes, like a weight had been lifted. This made me go crazy. I told him things no one should ever hear from someone they love. I told him I never saw him as husband material, that I didn't want kids with him because they wouldn't look like me. We were from different ethnic backgrounds, and I used that as an excuse to push him away. I knew it was wrong, but I did it anyway. After we broke up, he tried to move on. He blocked me, tried to cut me out of his life. but I couldn't let him go, not completely. I contacted him again under some silly pretense and we tried to be friends. But it didn't work. He finally realized that he needed to end it for good, and he did. He sent me an email telling me how he felt, telling me to leave him alone. He was right, but I couldn't stand it. My father, always protective, stepped in. He's an ex-Marine, a lawyer, and he didn't like the way things ended. He sent a warning telling him to stay away from me. But the truth is, I was the one who should have stayed away from him. I was the one who caused the pain, the confusion, the heartbreak. Now as I sit here alone with my thoughts, I realize what I did. I pushed away the one person who truly cared for me, who loved me despite all my flaws. I see now how toxic I was, how I hurt him just to feel in control. I regret it. I regret everything, but it's too late. He's gone, and I'm left with nothing but the memories of what could have been. I was the crazy one, the one who couldn't let go, the one who destroyed something beautiful. I never imagined the night could change me so completely. I was always the confident one, the woman who knew how to command a room. But tonight, something shifted. It all started innocently, a gathering with friends at our home. Mark, my husband, had invited them over, as we often did. There was an edge to the evening, a subtle tension in the air that I couldn't quite place. As the night wore on, the usual banter and laughter began to take on a different tone. It started with a simple game, a dare, just like the ones we played when we were younger. I thought nothing of it at first. It was all in good fun. But soon, the dares began to push boundaries, each one more daring than the last. The men, Mark's friends, were watching me closely, their eyes filled with something I couldn't quite define. It was as if I had become the focal point of their amusement. It started slowly, a dare to dance, to flirt, to let down my guard. The room seemed to close in on me as the men's gaze grew more intense, more predatory. I could feel my inhibitions slipping away, replaced by a strange, intoxicating thrill. It was a sensation I didn't recognize, and yet I was drawn to it. Each dare became a step further into the unknown. The challenges escalated, and I found myself complying, caught in the momentum of the moment. Mark's silence only amplified the tension. I kept looking at him, searching for a sign, anything to anchor me to reality. But his dark, unreadable eyes offered no comfort. Instead, they seemed to urge me on. Before I knew it, the dares had taken a turn I hadn't anticipated. The playful teasing morphed into something more intense, more physical. I was pulled into an embrace, hands exploring me with a hunger that left no room for hesitation. My breath hitched as I felt the weight of the situation pressing down on me. Yet I couldn't pull away. They pushed me to places I had never ventured, places I had never even imagined. I felt a mix of fear and excitement, a cocktail of emotions that left me dizzy and disoriented. The woman I had been just hours before seemed to fade into the background, replaced by someone I didn't recognize. And Mark just stood there. His friends pushed me further and still he did nothing. His silence was deafening, his presence looming over me like a shadow. It was at that moment that I realized he had orchestrated this. that he was enjoying watching me being consumed by the desires of others. The betrayal hit me like a cold wave, yet even then, I felt something else, a strange, twisted exhilaration that terrified me. The night became a blur of sensations. My body moved on instinct, responding to the touch of hands that were in marks, to whispers and demands that made my pulse quicken. I was swept up in a tide of emotions: fear, pleasure, shame, and something darker that I couldn't quite name. At one point, I tried to find my footing, to regain some semblance of control, but it was too late. The Rachel who had walked into that room had disappeared, replaced by someone else entirely. I was lost, trapped in a nightmare that had started as a simple game. And the worst part was, I wasn't sure I wanted to escape. Mark finally stepped forward, and I hoped, that maybe he would stop it, that he would pull me back from the edge. But when he joined in, his touch was familiar, yet the context was so foreign. I felt both relief and despair. At least now I wasn't alone in this degradation, but his involvement only made it more twisted. The night stretched on, the intensity never waning. I could feel my sense of self eroding with each passing second. The woman I had been, the confident, in control Rachel, was gone. In her place was someone who existed only to fulfill the desires of the men around her. As the night began to wind down, exhaustion set in. My body was marked by the night's events, my mind a tangled mess of emotions I couldn't even begin to unravel. I lay there trying to comprehend what had happened, but it was too much. All I knew was that something inside me had changed forever. Mark's friends began to leave, one by one, their expressions satisfied. Their laughter and jeers echoed in my mind, a haunting reminder of what I had become. And then, it was just the two of us, Mark and me, alone in the aftermath of the destruction we had wrought. Mark approached me, his eyes filled with a dark satisfaction that made my heart sink. I met his gaze, my heart heavy with the knowledge that this night had changed everything between us. Whatever connection we had shared was gone, replaced by something far more complex and disturbing. He finally spoke, his voice low, almost tender. "Are you okay?" he asked, as if his words could somehow undo what had just happened. I nodded, though I wasn't sure if I meant it. I couldn't bring myself to speak, the words caught in my throat. Instead, I just lay there, feeling the enormity of the situation pressing down on me. Mark reached out and brushed a strand of hair from my face, his touch gentle. But there was an edge to his actions, something that sent a shiver down my spine. "You're mine now," he said softly, his voice low and possessive, each word laced with an intensity that made my heart race. His hand lingered on my cheek, the warmth of his palm seeping into my skin, igniting a fire that spread through my entire body. I could feel the tension between us, thick and charged, as if the air itself had become electrified by the weight of his words. He leaned in closer, his breath hot against my neck, as his other hand trailed down my arm, his fingers tracing a slow, deliberate path that made my pulse quicken. I could sense the hunger in his movement, the barely restrained desire that shimmered just beneath the surface. It was as though he was holding himself back, savoring the anticipation, drawing out the moment until it was nearly unbearable. His lips brushed against my ear, sending a jolt of electricity through me, and I found myself leaning into him, drawn by an irresistible force that I couldn't explain. Mark's hand slid down to my waist, pulling me closer until our bodies were pressed together, the heat between us almost suffocating. I could feel the strength of his grip, the possessiveness in the way he held me, as though he was claiming me, marking me as his own. His lips found mine, the kiss searing and intense, a raw expression of the desire that had been building between us. The world around us seemed to fade away, leaving only the two of us, lost in the heat of the moment, consumed by the passion that had ignited like a wildfire, unstoppable and all-consuming. I had crossed the line and there was no going back. The life I had known, the woman I had been, it was all gone, replaced by something darker, something I wasn't sure I could live with. As Mark's gaze lingered on me, I realized that I was truly alone in this new reality. Whatever bond we had once shared had been severed, replaced by something far more twisted. The morning light filtered through the curtains. I lay there, my body aching, my mind numb. I tried to piece together the events of the night, but the more I tried, the more everything blurred into a haze of emotions and sensations. I felt hollow, like a part of me had been ripped away, leaving only an empty shell behind. Mark was still there, watching me with those same dark, unreadable eyes. There was a coldness to him now, something I hadn't seen before. He finally broke the silence, his voice cutting through the stillness. "Last night was a turning point," he said, his tone matter of fact. "Things are different now. You're different now." His words sent a chill down my spine. I knew he was right. I was different. The woman I had been, the confident, in control Rachel, was gone. In her place was someone else, someone who had been shaped by the events of the night. I didn't know who I was anymore, and that terrified me. I can still remember that evening vividly. It was raining softly, and the warmth of the room enveloped us as it traced circles on my skin. David had his hands wrapped around me, his breath warm against my neck. My heart raced, and my mind spun with emotions I didn't quite understand. This was wrong, forbidden even, but the thrill was overwhelming. I couldn't stop myself. As he kissed me, time stood still. His lips found mine with a hunger that sent shivers down my spine. His hands moved slowly, tracing every curve, igniting every inch of my skin. The room felt warmer, the air thick with desire, as he pressed his body against mine. I arched my back, lost in the sensation of his touch. He kissed my neck, trailing down to my collarbone, each kiss more intense than the last. My breath quickened, and my fingers tangled in his hair, pulling him closer. I felt his hand slide down my back, his fingers exploring, teasing, making my skin tingle with anticipation. He paused for a moment, looking into my eyes with an intensity that took my breath away. His gaze was a silent question, a final plea for permission, and I responded by closing the distance between us. Our bodies entwined, fitting together like pieces of a puzzle. He moved against me, and I gasped, overwhelmed by the sensation. It was a rhythm, a dance, one we both surrendered to willingly. Time blurred, the outside world forgotten. His touch grew more urgent, his movements deliberate, yet filled with a gentleness that made my heart ache. The room echoed with our breaths, mingling in the charged air. He whispered my name, his voice raw and filled with longing. And in that moment, I knew nothing else mattered except for this, us. Every inch of my body felt alive, responding to his touch, matching his rhythm, until we both reached the peak of that forbidden bliss together. This is where my story begins. My name is Lily. I was married to Ethan, a kind and thoughtful man, for nearly 5 years. Ethan and I had what most people would call a perfect marriage. He was my rock, the person who stood by me through all of life's ups and downs. We had a cozy little house in a peaceful neighborhood. Everything seemed flawless on the outside, but inside, I was grappling with something I couldn't explain. We had moved into this neighborhood 2 years ago, drawn by the charm of the quiet streets and friendly neighbors. It was here that I first met Daniel. He lived across the street, and from the very beginning, there was an undeniable spark between us. Daniel was effortlessly charming, with a roguish grin and eyes that could pierce right through to your soul. He was the kind of man who commanded attention wherever he went, and I found myself drawn to him like a moth to a flame. It all began innocently enough. Ethan and I would often invite Daniel over for weekend barbecues or dinners. The three of us got along well, and Ethan, trusting as he was, never suspected a thing. But every time Daniel and I exchanged glances, a forbidden current surged between us. It was subtle at first, just a fleeting brush of our hands or a shared look across the room. But the electricity was there, humming and irresistible. One evening, after Ethan left for a business trip, Daniel came over. It was late, and I had just put on my favorite movie to keep me company. The rain tapped against the windows, creating a cozy cocoon inside. When I opened the door to see him standing there, soaking wet, a shiver of excitement ran down my spine. He held up a bottle of wine, grinning that boyish grin of his. "Thought you might want some company," he said. I hesitated for a moment, but then nodded and stepped aside to let him in. We sat on the couch, sipping wine and talking about anything and everything. The air grew thick with tension, and at some point, our conversation stopped making sense. I felt his gaze on me, hot and intense. My heart pounded in my chest as he inched closer, his fingers lightly brushing my arm. I knew what was coming, but I couldn't stop it. I didn't want to. We kissed. It was gentle at first, then urgent and needy. My body betrayed me as I melted into him, forgetting all the reasons why this was a terrible idea. We made our way to the bedroom, leaving a trail of discarded clothing behind us. He pushed me gently onto the bed, his eyes locked onto mine, darkened with desire. His hands moved over me, his fingers tracing patterns on my skin that made me tremble. Slowly, deliberately, he leaned down, his mouth finding mine. His kiss was firm,
demanding, his tongue exploring, coaxing a soft moan from my lips. I melted under his touch, my hands slided up his back, pulling him closer, feeling the warmth of his body against mine. His mouth moved to my neck, his teeth grazing the sensitive skin there. I gasped, my fingers digging into his shoulders. He moved lower, trailing kisses down my chest, his hands exploring, leaving no part untouched. My skin burned with every brush of his lips, every caress of his fingers. He paused, looking up at me, and in that brief second, I saw everything we both were feeling: desire, fear, need. Without a word, he continued, his hands moving down, sending waves of pleasure through me. The room was filled with the sounds of our heavy breathing, the rustle of sheets, the quiet murmurs of our names. He moved over me, his body pressing against mine, fitting together perfectly. I clung to him, matching his rhythm, every movement sending a jolt of electricity through me. It was frantic, passionate, and impossibly tender all at once. My mind blurred with sensation as he pushed us both toward the edge, and together we tumbled into that abyss of shared ecstasy. As I lay there in the aftermath, tangled in shifts and guilt, I couldn't shake the feeling that I had crossed the line I could never uncross. From that moment on, everything changed. I couldn't get Daniel out of my head. Every time I saw him across the street, my stomach did flips. We began finding excuses to see each other. A cup of sugar borrowed, a casual chat on the sidewalk that lingered too long. Ethan remained blissfully unaware, working late hours and assuming our neighborly interactions were just that, neighborly. But one day, things took a turn I hadn't expected. It was a sunny afternoon, and I had just finished watering the garden when I saw Daniel walking over. My heart skipped a bit. He approached with that confident stride of his, eyes locked on mine. "I can't stop thinking about you," he whispered as he reached me, his voice laced with desire. My pulse quickened. I felt a rush of emotions: fear, excitement, guilt, all colliding inside me. Before I could respond, he pulled me into his arms and kissed me, right there in broad daylight. I pushed him away, glancing around nervously, but no one was watching. Yet, the danger of it made my knees weak. "We need to stop this," I murmured. But even as I said the words, I knew I didn't mean them. Later that evening, I couldn't get his words out of my head. Ethan was sitting in the living room, reading a book, completely unaware of the storm brewing within me. I excused myself to take a shower, needing some space to think. As the hot water cascaded over me, I closed my eyes, trying to wash away the guilt that clung to me. But thoughts of Daniel crept in, his hands on my skin, his lips on mine. Days passed in a haze of stolen glances and fleeting touches. I was playing a dangerous game, dancing on the edge of ruin. The thrill was intoxicating, and I became addicted to the secrecy, the adrenaline that came with every encounter. Yet, I knew it was only a matter of time before everything came crashing down. But I couldn't stop myself. Daniel's touch was magic. I couldn't resist it. He was all I thought of when I was in the shower. I wanted him so badly that I was ready to risk the beautiful life I had built. Marco, my son-in-law, had recently married my daughter, Isabel. They were a beautiful couple, young and full of dreams, and I was proud of them both. I had spent so many years focusing on my career, and perhaps I was not the mother Isabel needed me to be. But seeing her happy with Marco gave me a sense of peace I hadn't felt in a long time. I remember how it started. That evening, we were alone in the house. Isabel had flown to Rome for a work conference, and Marco and I were left to ourselves. There was something about being in that house, in the quiet, just the two of us, that felt different. Maybe it was the soft glow of the sunset through the window. Or maybe it was the way Marco looked at me, a lingering gaze that I should have ignored, but I didn't. He suggested we take a walk through the city, Venice, in all its romantic splendor. I couldn't resist. We wandered through narrow streets and along the canals, talking about everything. Life, love, art. Marco had always been an artist at heart, an architect by trade. And as he spoke about his passion for the city's beauty, I felt something shift between us. It was subtle at first, like a delicate note in a piece of music, but it grew louder with every step we took. That night, we found ourselves on a balcony overlooking the water. The city's light reflected in the canal, and the air was thick with tension. I knew I should leave, return to the safety of the guest room, but instead I stayed. I sat there beside Marco and we spoke in hushed tones, as if the world outside had ceased to exist. It was as if we were the only two people left in Venice. Then, as if on instinct, his hand brushed mine. It was an innocent touch at first, but the warmth of his skin sent a shiver down my spine. I knew what was happening and I knew it was wrong. He was my daughter's husband, and I had no right to feel what I was feeling. But I was weak and I was lonely. Years of being strong, of being the woman who overcame every obstacle, had worn me down. And in that moment, I let myself fall. Marco leaned in, his lips grazing my cheek, and I closed my eyes. My heart was pounding in my chest, and every rational thought fled from my mind. All that was left was the overwhelming desire to be close to him, to feel wanted, to feel alive. When his lips finally met mine, I didn't pull away. I kissed him back, and in that kiss, I knew we had crossed the line from which there was no return. As our kiss deepened, the world around us faded into the background. Marco's lips were soft but insistent, and the warmth of his touch seeped into my skin. I had forgotten what it felt like to be held like this, to be wanted with such intensity. My hand found its way to the back of his neck, pulling him closer, as if by doing so I could forget the weight of our betrayal. His breath was ragged against my cheek, and I could feel the rapid rise and fall of his chest as our hearts raced in unison. He guided me toward the open doors that led back into the dimly lit room. The air between us was thick with unspoken words, but neither of us could bring ourselves to say them. There was no need. Our connection, as forbidding as it was, spoke louder than any confession could. Marco's hands rested on my waist, his touch hesitant for just a moment, as though waiting for me to pull away. But I didn't. Instead, I leaned into him, allowing myself to be enveloped by the warmth of his embrace. We stood there, wrapped in each other, the sound of the distant water lapping at the canal barely reaching our ears. His hands caressed my arms, drawing me closer with every stroke, and I could feel the tension melting away, replaced by a quiet understanding. We knew we had crossed the line, and though guilt loomed in the distance, it didn't touch us in that moment. In his arms, I felt a spark of life that had been dormant for so long. And for now, I allowed myself to stay in the fragile beauty of it all. We made love, and he brought back feelings that I thought were long since dead. The days that followed were a blur of stolen moments and whispered confessions. We spent our days exploring the city like old friends, but at night, when the world was quiet, we became something else entirely. Marco and I would sit on the balcony after dark, wrapped in each other's arms, sharing secrets we had never told anyone. I told him about my past, about the sacrifices I had made to become the woman I was, and he listened with a tenderness that I hadn't known I needed. But with every touch, every kiss came the growing weight of guilt. I couldn't stop thinking about Isabel, my beautiful daughter, who trusted me, who trusted him. What had I done? What kind of mother was I, betraying her in the worst possible way? One evening, Marco and I sat on the edge of the bed, the glow from the moon casting long shadows on the walls. He looked at me with such intensity, such passion, and I felt my heart break. I wanted him, yes, but I also wanted to stop. I wanted to go back to being the woman I had been before all of this started. But it was too late. "Do you want this, Marco?" I asked him, my voice trembling. Without hesitation, he nodded. "Yes, Alina, I want you." Marco's eyes held mine, a storm of emotions swirling between us as we sat on the bed. His hand found mine, and without a word, I felt the weight of what we had become settle between us. When he leaned forward, his forehead resting gently against mine, the room fell silent. His breath was warm, his presence steady, and despite the turmoil in my heart, I couldn't deny the pull I felt toward him. I squeezed his hand, a silent acknowledgement of the impossible situation we were in. Without warning, Marco kissed me, softly, tentatively, as though afraid I might pull away. But I didn't. His lips lingered on mine, and in that kiss, there was something more than just desire. It was a connection, a quiet desperation to hold on to something that we both knew was slipping through our fingers. His hands traced the path of my arms, and I felt the weight of everything. The guilt, the longing, the regret settled on my shoulders, and yet I couldn't stop. In the stillness of the moonlit room, we held each other close, not speaking, not daring to break the fragile quiet. His touch was tender, reassuring, as though he understood the inner battle I was fighting. I rested my head against his chest, listening to the steady beat of his heart. It was a moment that felt suspended in time, where the reality of what we had done didn't exist. For that brief moment, it was just us, holding on to the last remnants of something we both knew could never last. Then he made love to me like no man ever had. I moaned loudly, losing control of my mind. It was pure bliss, and that was all it took. I was lost. We decided to leave Venice for a few days, to escape to a quiet town by the sea. We told ourselves it was just to clear our heads, to figure out what we were doing. But deep down, we both knew that this was our way of prolonging the inevitable. We were running away from the truth, from the consequences of our actions. Those days by the sea were like a dream. We spent our mornings on the beach, walking hand in hand along the shore, and our nights wrapped in each other's arms. There was no past, no future, only the present moment, and in that moment, I allowed myself to believe that what we had was real, that it wasn't just a mistake born of loneliness and desire, that maybe somehow it could last. But it couldn't. Reality came crashing back, as it always does. Isabel returned from Rome, and I had to look her in the eyes knowing what I had done. I had betrayed her in the most unforgivable way, and there was no going back. The guilt was suffocating, and I knew that I had to end things with Marco, no matter how much he hurt. One night, after Isabel had gone to bed, I found Marco on the balcony, staring out at the city. He didn't say anything when I approached, and for a moment we just stood there in silence. Then, without looking at me, he spoke. "We can't keep doing it, Selena." "I know," I whispered, my voice barely audible. "I know." We stood there, side by side, watching the lights flicker in the distance. And in that silence, I realized just how much I had lost. Not just Marco, but the trust of my daughter, the love of my family, and perhaps most of all, my own self-respect. I don't know if Isabel will ever forgive me for what I've done. I don't know if I'll ever forgive myself. But one thing I do know is that I will carry the weight of this mistake with me for the rest of my life. Because in the end, no matter how much love or passion there may be, some lines should never be crossed. I was in the kitchen, stirring the pot of soup I had made for dinner. Jack, my sister's ex-husband, was sitting on the couch, watching TV. His kids were playing in the other room, their laughter echoing through the house. It felt so normal, so right. I walked over and sat next to him, close enough to feel his warmth. Without thinking, I leaned in, and before I knew it, our lips touched. I leaned back, feeling a surge of emotions I hadn't expected. Jack's lips were warm, soft, and familiar in a way that made my heart race. He pulled away slightly, his eyes locking onto mine, as if searching for any sign to stop. I didn't want to stop. I reached up, cupping his face with my hands, and brought him back to me. Our kiss deepened, slow and exploring, like we were discovering something new and precious between us. He wrapped his arms around my waist, pulling me closer until I was practically in his lap. My heart pounded. My breath came out in short gasps as his hand slid up my back, drawing me into him. I could feel the tension melting away, replaced by a warmth that spread through my whole body. We moved together, in sync, as if every touch, every brush of skin was saying the things we hadn't been able to put into words. The room around us blurred. The only thing that mattered was this moment. I tangled my fingers in his hair, sighing against his mouth as he gently traced his lips along my jawline. It was tender, almost reverent, and it left me feeling breathless. We made love, and then fell asleep in each other's embrace. Let me back up a bit. My name is Marie, and yes, I'm the sister of Jack's ex-wife, Rachel. Rachel and Jack married young, but it didn't take long for things to fall apart. Rachel made some bad choices, got involved with the wrong crowd, and eventually left him and the kids. I watched him from the sidelines as Jack struggled to pick up the pieces and build a new life for himself and his children. He was strong, but I could see the loneliness in his eyes. I felt sorry for him. I couldn't help it. I started visiting him more often, mostly to help with the kids. At first, I just wanted to be there for them all, especially for my niece and nephew who missed their mother. Jack always looked so tired, so broken. I couldn't stand it. I began cooking for them, helping with the kids' homework, and just being there. Somewhere along the way, my pity turned into something more. One night, after a long day of helping Jack with the kids, we sat down with a glass of wine. The house was silent, except for the occasional creak of the wooden floor as the kids slept. We talked about everything, our childhood, our dreams, and even our fears. He shared stories about Rachel, their happy moments before it all went wrong. I felt a pang of guilt, but also a strange sense of connection with him. He looked at me with those sad, tired eyes, and I couldn't help but reach out and hold his hand. The warmth of his touch sent a jolt through me, but I quickly pulled away, feeling confused. Weeks went by, and Jack and I grew closer. I told myself it was just friendship. He was lonely and I was just trying to help. But deep down, I knew it was more than that. I began looking forward to our late night talks, the quiet dinners, and the way he would smile at me when I came over. I felt guilty, knowing this was my sister's ex-husband. But wasn't she the one who left? She had hurt him so much, and I was just picking up the pieces she had shattered. One evening, things changed. I was at Jack's place as usual, cooking dinner, while he helped the kids with their homework. I watched him as he laughed and joked with them, and my heart ached. Here was a man who had been through so much, yet he was still so loving, so kind. After dinner, when the kids were in bed, we sat on the couch, the room filled with a heavy silence. My heart was pounding, and I could hardly breathe as I felt the weight of his gaze on me. Jack reached out, his hand hesitating in the air before finally resting on mine. His touch sent a spark through me, lighting up emotions I had tried so hard to ignore. I looked up at him, my eyes betraying everything I was feeling. Before I could say anything, he leaned in, his lips capturing mine in a kiss that felt like it had been waiting forever to happen. It wasn't a planned kiss. It just happened, and it felt so right. My heart raced, my head spun, and all the guilt and confusion I had been feeling melted away. The kiss was soft at first, a gentle brush of lips that left me dizzy. Then it grew deeper, more intense, as if we were both pouring every unsaid word, every hidden feeling into that moment. He pulled me closer, his arms circling my waist, and I felt myself melting into him. The warmth of his body, the way he held me like I was something precious, it made my heart race and my skin tingle. His hand slid up to cup my face, tilting my head as he kissed me again. Slower this time. I shivered, my body reacting to every touch, every whispered breath between us. I moved my hands to his shoulders, gripping onto him like he was my anchor in a storm. Our movements became slower, more tender, each one lingering as we lost ourselves in the quiet intimacy of the moment. Then he led himself into me and we made love. I had never felt a man the way I felt Jack that night. But things didn't stay simple for long. As our secret relationship grew, so did the fear. What if Rachel found out? What would people say? I tried to keep my feelings in check, but every time I looked at Jack, I felt my heart swell. He was so different from anyone I had ever been with, so gentle, so caring. And he needed me, maybe even more than I needed him. One day, as we sat together in his living room, he turned to me and said, "Marie, I can't keep pretending anymore. I love you." His words hit me like a wave, washing over all the doubt and fear I had been carrying. I felt tears prick at the corner of my eyes. "I love you too," I whispered back, my voice trembling. For a moment, everything felt perfect. We had found something beautiful in the middle of all the chaos. But then, the storm hit. It was a week later when Rachel found out. I don't know how she knew, but one morning, my phone rang and it was her. She screamed and cried, calling me every name in the book. "How could you do this to me?" she yelled. I tried to explain, to tell her that she was the one who left, that she had broken his heart long before I came into the picture, but she wouldn't listen. I hung up, my hands shaking. I felt like a horrible person. I looked at Jack, who had heard the entire conversation, and saw the worry in his eyes. "We'll get through this," he said, taking my hands in his. I wanted to believe him, but I knew things would never be the same. The next few weeks were a whirlwind of drama and pain. My family found out, and some of them turned their backs on me. Others were supportive, saying that Rachel had lost her right to be upset when she abandoned Jack and the kids. But the tension was unbearable. I started questioning everything. Was this worth it? Was our love strong enough to survive the storm? I never thought it would come to this. I never imagined I'd be the kind of person who would betray the man who gave me everything. His heart, his trust, his love. But here I am, telling my story, drenched in regret and shame. It all started when I went back to the office after the lockdown. Before that, my husband and I had shared such a wonderful life together. We laughed, we shared hobbies, we spent time together. But once we were forced to work from home during the lockdown, something shifted. We were close, too close, and yet so far apart. The silence between us was deafening, and before I even realized it, resentment was building inside me. At first, I brushed it off, thinking it was just a phase. We spent all day together, but we were growing distant. He shut himself in his office for hours, and I felt invisible, like I wasn't even there. He seemed content with the routine, but I felt suffocated by it. When the office reopened, it felt like freedom. I was able to step out of the house, be around people who saw me, really saw me, and not just as someone stuck in the same cycle. That's where it all began. The group of women I got close to at work, especially two of them, planted seeds of doubt in my mind. They had gone through divorces, and they constantly told me that I deserved more. They psychoanalyzed my life, my marriage, my husband. They fed me lines about how I needed someone who could challenge me, someone who wasn't intimidated by my success. Then there was him, my boss. He was charming, confident, and attentive in ways I hadn't experienced in years. At first, it was innocent. A smile, a compliment, harmless chats after work. But soon, those conversations turned into something more, something dangerous. I didn't plan on having an affair. I never woke up one morning and thought, I'm going to destroy my marriage today. But there's a thin line between temptation and surrender, and I crossed it. I never forget that day. I was in a hotel room just across the street from work. We sneaked in like criminals. The air was thick with anticipation as soon as the door clicked shut behind us. The room was dimly lit, casting long shadows across the walls, but all I could focus on was him. His eyes locked with mine, and for a moment, time seemed to stop. Without a word, he crossed the space between us, his hands gently cupping my face.
before his lips met mine in a slow, deliberate kiss. It wasn't rushed or frantic, but full of an intensity that made my knees weaken. The electricity between us was undeniable, and as he deepened the kiss, I felt every bit of the weight of what we were doing. Yet I couldn't pull away. His hands slid down my sides, grazing my skin as he moved closer, his body pressing against mine. I felt the heat of him, every breath he took, matched by my own rapid pulse. We tumbled onto the bed, a tangle of limbs and unspoken desire, the world outside fading into nothingness. His touch was both urgent and tender, as though he was savoring every second, every inch of me. My mind fought to grasp the enormity of what was happening, but my body had already surrendered. Each touch, each whisper of his breath against my skin was a reminder of how starved I had been for this kind of passion, this kind of connection. As we moved together, everything else ceased to matter. There was no guilt, no second thoughts, just the raw, unfiltered emotion of the moment. His lips traced a path down my neck, across my collarbone, and I arced beneath him, lost in the sensation. It was a dance of need and release, a fleeting escape from reality, and for those stolen moments, I forgot about the consequences. All I knew was that I wanted him, and he wanted me. We gave in to the undeniable force that had been building between us for so long. It was reckless, it was wrong, but in that hotel room, it was everything. I continued seeing him behind my husband's back. At first, it felt thrilling, a secret world where I was desired, where I wasn't just a wife or an employee, but a woman with passion and excitement. I justified it, telling myself that my husband had emotionally checked out long before I did. I convinced myself that what I was doing wasn't wrong because I wasn't happy. But with each encounter, the guilt gnawed at me. I would come home and look at my husband, knowing I was betraying him, yet unable to stop. He had no idea, no clue what was happening. His love for me remained unchanged, and that made it worse. I was unfaithful, and I knew it. Then, it all came crashing down. I had been careless, leaving my old iPad lying around, thinking he wouldn't check. But he did. He found everything, the messages, the photos, the lies I had woven. I can still picture the look on his face, the hurt in his eyes when he finally confronted me. It was like someone had torn his soul apart. He didn't explode right away. In fact, that almost made it worse. He was calm, too calm. He told me he had seen everything, but he didn't yell. His silence was deafening. I felt small, like I was shrinking into nothing. But when he finally snapped, it was like a storm had been unleashed. He shouted, cursed, called me every name under the sun, and I deserved every word. I had broken him. I had taken our marriage, our vows, and shattered them into a million pieces. He told me he had hired a lawyer, that he was going to divorce me. And the worst part, I laughed. I didn't mean to, but I did. I was so wrapped up in my delusion, so lost in the lies I had been telling myself, that I couldn't take him seriously.
I said things I regret, terrible things, that I get half his paycheck, that he should just stick with me for the sex, because that's all he'd get from anyone. I was cruel, heartless. I didn't even recognize myself. Then came the cake, the humiliating public serving of the divorce papers at work. He had an image of me and my boss printed on a cake, and those haunting words, "Here's your cake, eat it too." The moment I saw it, I felt like the ground beneath me had crumbled. My co-workers, my boss, they all saw it. My world, which I had built on lies, collapsed in front of me. I lashed out, swatted the cake to the ground, but it was too late. The damage was done. I could hear the whispers, feel the stares of judgment from everyone around me. The humiliation was unbearable. I wanted to disappear, to run away from the wreckage I had caused. Now I'm left picking up the pieces. My husband, the man I betrayed, is moving forward with the divorce. I can't undo what I've done, no matter how much I wish I could. I've lost him. I've lost everything. The romance I chased was fleeting, a mirage, and now all I'm left with is regret. Heavy, suffocating regret. And the worst part, I miss him. I miss the man I used to love, the man I threw away for a moment of weakness. If I could go back, I would, but it's too late. He's gone, and I'm left with the mess I've made, wondering if I'll ever feel whole again. I never thought I'd fall for someone so much younger, let alone my best friend's son. Yet here I am, 45 years old, tangled in emotions I can't quite control. My name is Olivia, and this is my story of love, temptation, and regret. It all started when Cassie asked if her son Jack could stay with us for a few weeks while he sorted out his living arrangements before starting college. Jack was just 21, full of life, with a charm that made everyone around him light up. I had known him since he was a child, so when Cassie asked, I said yes without hesitation. My husband Richard didn't mind either. We had a comfortable marriage, stable, predictable, even if a bit dull at times. I loved Richard, but the spark we once had was gone. Jack's arrival was like a gust of fresh air in our otherwise routine life. At first, it was all very innocent. Jack settled in quickly, and I took it upon myself to show him around town. We spent our days exploring parks, coffee shops, and local bookstores. He was curious about everything, and I found myself drawn to his energy and enthusiasm. As the days passed, I noticed he started lingering around me more, asking questions, looking at me with those intense blue eyes. I tried to ignore it, telling myself it was just a young man's harmless curiosity. One evening, after Richard had gone to bed, Jack and I sat in the kitchen sipping wine. It had become a little tradition for us, this quiet moment of conversation after a long day. But this time, the atmosphere was different. He moved closer, his knee brushing against mine. I could feel the warmth of his skin through my jeans, and my heart began to race. I tried to make small talk to distract myself, but the tension in the air was palpable. "Olivia," he said softly, his voice barely above a whisper. "Have you ever felt like you were missing something in life?" His eyes bore into mine, and I felt a shiver run down my spine. I wanted to tell him it was complicated, that my life wasn't missing anything that mattered. But something in his gaze made me hesitate. Yes, sometimes, I admitted, my voice shaky. But that's just part of life, right? Jack reached out and took my hand, his touch sending a jolt through me. I don't think it has to be, he murmured, his eyes never leaving mine. My breath caught in my throat. I knew I should pull away, laugh it off, set boundaries. But I didn't. Instead, I let him hold my hand, feeling the warmth and softness of his skin against mine. The room grew quiet, the hum of the refrigerator the only sound filling the space between us. Jack's hand still held mine, and I found myself leaning closer, the wine and the moment clouding my thoughts. His eyes softened, searching mine as if waiting for permission. When I didn't pull away, he moved forward, his lips brushing softly against mine. A flutter of excitement and uncertainty danced within me, and I closed my eyes, surrendering to the tenderness of his kiss. His hands moved to cup my face, his touch gentle yet urgent. I felt my heart pounding against my chest as he deepened the kiss, his lips exploring mine with a careful passion. I responded, my fingers finding their way to his hair, pulling him closer. The world outside melted away, leaving just the two of us, caught up in a whirlpool of emotions. He kissed me again, slowly this time, savoring each moment, his warmth pressing against mine in the dimly lit kitchen. He paused, his forehead resting against mine, both of us breathless. "We shouldn't," I whispered, though my voice was shaky, betraying the longing I felt. Jack's thumb stroked my cheek softly, and he nodded, understanding the gravity of what we were doing. He knew I wasn't going to stop him. Slowly, he took off my clothing. I allowed him to take control. Jack was confident and he knew how to please a woman. It took all my willpower to keep my moans within. He made love to me like no man ever had. As the days turned into weeks, my heart would skip a bit every time he looked at me with those piercing eyes, and I found myself craving his attention more and more. But I did everything to stay away from him. I convinced myself that the first time was a mistake. One night, Richard was working late, and Jack appeared at the door. We watched the movie, sitting close on the couch, our shoulders brushing against each other. As the credits rolled, he turned to me, his face inches from mine. "Olivia, I can't stop thinking about you," he confessed, his voice filled with raw honesty. My heart pounded in my chest. I knew this was wrong, knew I was crossing a line that couldn't be uncrossed, but the yearning in his eyes matched the storm of emotions inside me. "Jack, we can't do this anymore," I whispered, though my voice lacked conviction. "Why not?" he asked, his hand moving to cup my cheek. "I know you feel it too." Before I could think, his lips were on mine, soft and warm. I gasped, my mind screaming at me to stop, but my body refused to listen. I kissed him back, feeling a rush of excitement and fear all at once. His hand slid around my waist, pulling me closer, and I melted into him, letting go of everything except the desire that had built up inside me. We stole moments whenever we could, a touch as we passed in the hallway, a kiss when Richard wasn't looking. It was thrilling, exhilarating, like we were playing a dangerous game. The more we spent together, the deeper I fell. Jack was everything I had forgotten I could feel. Young, passionate, and full of life. For the first time in years, I felt truly alive. But with each stolen moment, guilt gnawed at me. Cassie was my best friend, and Richard, my husband, didn't deserve this betrayal. Yet I couldn't stop. The thrill of it all was intoxicating, blinding me to the consequences. Then came the day it all unraveled. Jack and I were in the kitchen, laughing and talking in hushed tones. I leaned in to kiss him just as Richard walked in. He froze, eyes wide, mouth agape. The shock and hurt evident on his face. "What the hell is going on here?" he demanded, his voice shaking with anger and betrayal. My heart sank as I pulled away from Jack, reality crashing down on me. I had been so caught up in the excitement that I hadn't thought about what it would cost. Jack's face went pale, and he looked at me, panic and regret flashing in his eyes. "It's not what it looks like," I stammered, though we all knew that was a lie. Richard turned and walked out, slamming the door behind him. The sound echoed through the house, a harsh reminder of the damage I had caused. Jack and I stared at each other, the silence heavy between us. The magic was gone, replaced by a hollow feeling of loss and regret. I realized then what a fool I had been. I had let myself get swept up in a fantasy, ignoring the reality of the people I was hurting. Jack left the next morning, saying goodbye with a lingering glance that broke my heart. As the days passed, I tried to pick up the pieces of my shattered life. Richard couldn't look at me without anger and pain in his eyes. Cassie found out, of course, and she cut me out of her life. I lost my best friend, my marriage, and the piece of myself that I'd never get back. Now, when I sit alone in the quiet of my empty house, I think back on those moments with Jack. I remember the thrill, the passion, the way he made me feel alive. But more than anything, I remember the cost of giving in to temptation. The excitement was real, yes, but it wasn't worth the price I paid. I regret it all, not just because I got caught, but because I hurt the people I loved most. And that's something I'll have to live with for the rest of my life. My name is Rachel, and this year has been a roller coaster I never saw coming. It all started so innocently, as these things often do. My husband, Nick, and I were doing our usual grocery run at the start of the year when we ran into her. Her name was Jessica. She had this perfectly styled blonde hair, a smile that felt a little too wide, and an aura that immediately made my skin crawl. But I didn't think much of it at the time. Nick introduced us in that casual way people do when they run into an old friend. "Rachel, this is Jessica, an old friend from college," Nick said, his eyes lingering on her for just a moment too long. He seemed excited, more than he should have been. I laughed it off, thinking it was just the awkwardness of running into someone from his past. I shook her hand, feeling a little pang of something I couldn't quite place. It wasn't jealousy exactly, but I was uneasy. Still, I told myself it was nothing. We finished our shopping and went home, but the way Nick talked about her later that night stuck with me. Over the next few weeks, I noticed things that seemed off. At first, it was small. Nick's phone buzzing a little more frequently. His laughter while reading texts that he didn't share with me. But then, he started taking calls late at night. When I asked, he would say it was just work or an old buddy. He didn't mention Jessica by name, but I could feel her presence creeping into our lives. Things escalated when Jessica invited us to her Super Bowl party. "It'll be fun," Nick said, smiling in that way that used to make me melt, but now just made me suspicious. I didn't want to go, but I couldn't think of a reason not to. When we got there, the party was loud, and everyone was having a good time. But the whole night, I couldn't shake the way Nick's eyes kept wandering toward Jessica. She was wearing this tight, low-cut top, and every time she walked past, Nick's gaze followed. He was blatantly checking her out, and she seemed to enjoy it. The worst part, she didn't even try to hide it. She smiled at him like they were sharing some private joke. I confronted him as soon as we got home. "Nick, what the hell was that? You were practically drooling over her all night." He brushed it off. "You're overreacting, Rachel. It was nothing. She's just a friend." "A friend?" I snapped, my voice rising. "Friends don't look at each other like that." He just sighed, rubbing his forehead. "You're making something out of nothing." But I knew, deep down I knew something wasn't right. A week later, I decided to follow my gut. Nick told me he was going to play golf with his friends. Normally, I wouldn't have questioned it, but this time, I felt a knot in my stomach. When I tried calling him later, his phone went straight to voicemail. Something was wrong. I called my best friend Lucy and borrowed her car, not wanting to be spotted in mine. I drove by Jessica's house, my hands shaking on the steering wheel. And there it was, Nick's car parked in front of our house. My heart dropped into my stomach. As I sat there, trying to gather my thoughts, Jessica came out to grab the mail, wearing nothing but a loose shirt and underwear. She didn't see me, but the sight of her like that made my blood boil. I knew then that Nick had been lying to me, but I had no solid proof, just this awful, gnawing suspicion. The days after that were a blur of anxiety. Nick became more distant, barely speaking to me or the kids. He spent hours on his phone, always smiling at something I wasn't a part of. I tried to convince myself I was imagining things, that maybe I was being paranoid. But every time I closed my eyes, all I could see was him with her. Finally, I couldn't take it anymore. I went to an electronics store and bought a small recording device, the kind you could hide easily. I slipped it into Nick's car, hoping for answers. A few days later, I retrieved it, my hands trembling as I pressed play. My heart shattered as I heard Nick's voice, soft, flirty, talking to Jessica. They giggled like teenagers, him calling her sexy, and her loving every second of it. The anger that flooded through me was indescribable. It felt like a fire consuming everything I thought I knew. I called Lucy again, and we swapped cars. I wasn't done. I needed to see it for myself. That night, I followed Nick to a bar. My heart raced as I parked far enough away to not be noticed, but close enough to see them. And there she was, sitting at the bar, waiting for him. The second Nick walked in, he went straight to her, touching her like he had forgotten I even existed. They laughed, they kissed, and then they disappeared into the back. That night, as I watched from the shadows, my heart clenched when Nick leaned in toward Jessica. His hand slid down her arm slowly, fingers brushing against her skin like it was the most natural thing in the world. She responded immediately, leaning into him, her lips parting in a soft laugh. They moved closer, their bodies pressed against one another, their chemistry undeniable. Nick's eyes were filled with something I hadn't seen in a long time, a hunger that tore at my insides. He whispered something in her ear, and she nodded, her hand gripping his wrist as they walked towards the back of the bar together. I followed, my stomach in knots as I trailed behind, careful not to make a sound. I reached the back hallway just as they disappeared through a door, leaving it ajar. Through the narrow crack, I saw them. Nick held her close, their foreheads touching as he murmured words I couldn't make out. Jessica's hand slid around his waist, pulling him tighter, her breath shallow. It was intimate, far too intimate for two people who weren't supposed to be anything more than old flames. His hand moved to her face, gently tilting her chin up before he pressed his lips to hers in a slow, deliberate kiss, one that felt like a betrayal I could never forgive. They moved together, swaying in sync as if no one else in the world existed. His lips traveled to her neck, lingering in a way that made it clear this wasn't the first time they'd been this close. Her body responded to him, arcing toward him like she craved every inch of his touch. The room seemed to pulse with their connection, and I could feel the walls closing in on me. My throat tightened, my heart shattered, and in that moment I knew the truth. This wasn't just a fling. It was something deeper, something that had been growing between them while I was left in the dark. I felt sick. My world was crumbling before my eyes, but I wasn't ready to confront him, not yet. The next morning, I cornered his co-worker, Adam, who had been at the bar with them earlier. "What's going on with Nick and Jessica?" I demanded, my voice trembling with fury. At first, Adam tried to deny it, but after a while, he couldn't look me in the eye. "Rachel, I didn't want to be the one to tell you this, but it's been going on for weeks." I thought he'd stop, but I didn't let him finish. The words hit me like a freight train. Weeks, not just a mistake, not a moment of weakness. This was planned, deliberate. That night, when Nick came home, I was waiting for him in the living room. "We need to talk," I said, my voice barely holding together. He tried to act confused, but I could see the guilt in his eyes. "About what?" "About Jessica. About you sneaking around with her." Nick's face twisted in anger. You've been spying on me? I had to, Nick. You've been lying to me for months, I yelled, my voice breaking. I know everything. I saw you with her. He stared at me, the realization of how much I knew sinking in. Rachel, it's not what you think. Don't lie to me, I screamed, tears streaming down my face. You've destroyed everything. Our marriage, our family. How could you do this? Nick looked at me for a long moment, his face hardening. I can't do this right now. And with that, he turned and walked out the door. Later that night, his best friend James called me. Rachel, listen, Nick told me everything. He wants to talk to you, to explain. But I wasn't ready to hear his excuses. Not yet. All I could think about was how my life had changed in the blink of an eye. I thought I knew Nick. We had built a life together, had kids together, and yet here he was, sneaking around with another woman. I hung up the phone, the silence in the house feeling heavier than ever. How could he do this to me? To us? But one thing was clear. I wasn't going to let him get away with it. Not without a fight. The room was filled with the warmth of a romantic embrace. His hands were on my back, and I could feel his breath against my neck. The passion was overwhelming, a mix of lust and guilt that made my heart race faster. I pressed my body closer to his, needing the comfort and the thrill he brought. The tension between us finally snapped, and he lifted me effortlessly, pressing me against the wall. His lips moved hungrily along my neck, trailing hot kisses that made my skin tingle. My breath hitched as his hands roamed my back, sliding under the fabric of my shirt. I gasped, surrendering to the mix of excitement and guilt. Every touch, every kiss was an electric jolt that pushed me further into the storm of desire. His hand explored every inch of my body, leaving trails of fire in their wake. He pulled me closer, our bodies molding together like pieces of a puzzle meant to fit. The room blurred around us, and all that existed was the heat between us. My fingers dug into his shoulders, pulling him even closer as he pressed his lips against mine, deepening the kiss with a fervor that made me dizzy. He moved us to the bed, and I felt the soft sheets beneath me as he leaned over. Our eyes locked, searching each other for any sign of hesitation. There was none. Only hunger and the desperate need to feel something real. His touch was demanding yet tender, and as he leaned down, our bodies intertwined, and I surrendered to the flood of emotions washing over me. But that wasn't my husband. No, my husband wasn't here. He had left, and I was standing there with my emotions spiraling out of control. My life now teetering on the brink of something I had never thought possible. How did I get here? My name is Claudia, and I was married to Michael for 10 years. We had a picture-perfect life, or at least that's what everyone believed. On the outside, we were the ideal couple. Successful careers, a beautiful home, and friends who envied our relationship. But inside, my marriage had turned into a void, a chasm of unmet desires and unspoken words. I remember the last time I tried to reach out to Michael. It was the day before my so-called girls' weekend. He was working on his laptop, completely immersed in whatever was more important than us. I stood in the doorway, hesitating before speaking. "Michael, can we talk?" I had asked in a small voice, hoping for some sign of interest. Without turning around, he sighed and responded curtly. "Now? Really, I'm in the middle of something." My heart sank and anger bubbled up inside me. "You always have time for everything except us," I spat out. He snapped the laptop shut, finally giving me his attention. "What do you want, Claudia?" His voice was cold, detached, and I knew this conversation was going nowhere. "You know, I've been trying to talk to you for weeks. I feel like I'm invisible in this marriage. You're just not here anymore." He stood up, walked past me to get a glass of water, and then spoke with an unsettling calmness. "Claudia, we both know that this isn't working. Your so-called weekend getaway is nothing more than an escape from our problems." I wanted to scream, to shake him and make him understand how much pain I was in. But I didn't. I just turned away and left, packing my things in silence for the weekend I had planned. The trip to the beach house was supposed to be a distraction, a chance to clear my head and find some semblance of happiness. I went there alone, even though I had lied to Michael, telling him I was going with friends. As I sat by the window, staring out at the ocean waves, my mind wandered to everything that was wrong in my life. That's when I first noticed Lucas. He was our neighbor, the one who had moved into the house next door a few months ago. Tall, dark hair with piercing blue eyes that seemed to see right through me. I had exchanged polite nods and casual greetings with him in the past, but this time was different. He walked over to my deck, shirtless and glistening with seawater. "Hey, Claudia," he called out with a smile. "Need some company?" I should have said no. I should have walked inside, closed the door, and locked away any thoughts of temptation. But I didn't. "Sure," I replied, forcing a smile as he climbed the steps to sit beside me. We talked for hours that day, about nothing and everything. Life, dreams, regrets. It felt like he was peeling away the layers of my sadness, exposing the raw, aching heart beneath. As the sun dipped below the horizon, our conversation turned silent, replaced by an electric tension that neither of us dared to break. Finally, he reached out, cupping my face with his hand, and I felt myself leaning into his touch, craving that warmth I had been missing for so long. "Claudia," he whispered, "I know this is crazy, but I want you." My heart pounded against my ribs. I knew it was wrong, yet every part of me screamed to feel alive again. I moved closer, our lips brushing softly at first, then deeper, hungrier. The world around us faded, leaving only the sound of our breathing and the rush of emotions swirling between us. His hands roamed my back, pulling me closer while I entangled in his hair. I melted into him, into this forbidden, reckless moment of passion. His lips moved over mine with a slow, deliberate intensity, tasting and savoring every second. My hands gripped his shirt, pulling him closer as the world outside disappeared. The soft glow of twilight filtered through the window, casting a warm hue over our tangled limbs. His touch was like a drug, making my heart race and my skin flush. The quiet in the room only amplified every brush of his fingers, every gasp that escaped my lips. He shifted us, guiding me gently onto the couch, his body hovering over mine with a tenderness that made my heart ache. His hand slipped under my blouse, tracing the curves of my body, exploring me like he had all the time in the world. The warmth of his breath against my ear sent shivers down my spine. I closed my eyes, sinking into the blissful haze of desire, feeling his lips move to my collarbone, leaving a trail of heat in their path. Our movements grew more urgent, more frantic, as if we were racing against the clock. His touch became firmer, more demanding, and I responded in kind, my body arcing into his. It was a dance of longing and passion, a release of all the pent-up emotions that had been bubbling under the surface. With every kiss, every touch, we lost ourselves in this forbidden moment, letting the raw intensity of our need sweep us away. The next morning, reality came crashing down on me. I woke up in his arms, my heart heavy with guilt and confusion. I slipped out of bed and stood by the window, staring out at the waves. "Are you okay?" Lucas's voice was soft, laced with concern. I turned to look at him, my emotions a tangled mess. "No," I admitted, "I'm not." "We don't have to make this complicated," he said gently, sitting up and reaching for me. "But you need to decide what you want, Claudia. You can't keep living in that loveless marriage." His words stung because they were the truth I had been avoiding. I couldn't continue living in a lie, pretending everything was okay. But leaving Michael, could I really do that? I stayed silent, wrapping myself in a robe and walking out onto the deck to clear my mind. The ocean's endless expanse reflected the storm inside me. I had betrayed my marriage, my vows, yet for the first time in years, I felt alive. Returning home, I found Michael in the living room, surrounded by packed boxes. My heart sank. "What's going on?" I asked, already knowing the answer. He turned to face me, his eyes cold. "I found out about your little weekend. So tell me, Claudia, was it worth it?" I froze, unable to speak. He knew. How could he not? The guilt and the lies had finally caught up to me. "Michael, save it!" He cut me off, throwing papers onto the coffee table. "Divorce papers. I'm done." I felt my knees buckle, tears welling up in my eyes. "Please, Michael, let's talk about this," I pleaded, reaching for him. He stepped back, a look of disdain on his face. "The time to talk was long before this. You chose your path, Claudia, and I've chosen mine." With those words, he walked past me, out of the room, out of our life together, leaving me standing there with a hollow ache in my chest. I wanted to scream, to beg, to tell him that I was sorry, but I didn't. I just stood there, the silence in the room now echoing the emptiness of my heart. I remember his touch, the way his fingers traced the outline of my face, his lips pressing gently against mine. I remember his touch, the way his fingers traced the outline of my face, his lips pressing gently against mine. His hand, warm and gentle, slid down to my shoulders, pulling me closer until our bodies were pressed together, heat radiating between us. My heart pounded in my chest as his breath mingled with mine, each kiss deepening, becoming more urgent, more necessary. His fingers tangled in my hair, tilting my head back, allowing his lips to explore my neck, trailing soft kisses that sent shivers through my skin. I melted into him, feeling his strength and tenderness collide in the way he held me, the way his hand moved down my back, tracing the curves of my body with a slow, deliberate touch. His lips met mine again, hungry this time, full of passion that had been building, unspoken between us for so long. My hands roamed over his chest, feeling the rise and fall of his breath as we lost ourselves in each other, in the moment that felt like it could last forever. We sank down together, his body above mine, his weight comforting, grounding me as the world faded away. His hands found mine, fingers entwining, holding tight as our breath synced. The rhythm between us becoming a silent conversation. His eyes locked on mine, a mixture of tenderness and desire that made me feel more seen than ever before. In that moment, it was just us, our hearts and bodies moving together as one, wrapped in the heat of the night, the intensity of our connection consuming everything else. It felt like a dream, like something out of a romance novel. His name was Lucas, my brother's best friend. I knew it was wrong from the start, but I couldn't help myself. I had been in love with him for years. The moment I gave in, the guilt began to creep in too. He had a girlfriend, and my brother Dave would never forgive me if he found out. But in those stolen moments, none of that seemed to matter. I just wanted to feel wanted, loved, and cherished. Lucas made me feel all of that and more. But deep down, I knew it wouldn't last. Then came the day I realized I was pregnant. The shock was overwhelming, and my first instinct was panic. I didn't know what to do. I was terrified of losing Lucas, of facing Dave, and of what everyone would think of me. More than that, I didn't know if I could handle raising a child. I wasn't ready for motherhood, and Lucas had made it clear that our relationship was nothing more than a secret fling. He would never leave his girlfriend for me. That's when the idea came to me. I knew it was wrong, but it was the only way I could think of to save myself. I would pin the pregnancy on someone else. Maybe then I wouldn't have to face the consequences of my actions. Maybe then I wouldn't lose everything. There was one person who could take the fall, Jake, a quiet guy who had always had a crush on me. We had gone out a few times, but nothing serious had ever happened between us. I figured he was the perfect target. He wasn't close to Lucas or my brother, and he wasn't the type to fight back. If I could convince him that the baby was his, maybe I could avoid the shame and judgment that I knew was coming. But first, I needed to make love to him. That night, I invited him to my apartment. I was in my short, sexy dress, and I had a bottle of red wine. That night, I invited him to my apartment. I was in my short, sexy dress, and I had a bottle of red wine. Jake walked in, his eyes lingering on me as I poured the wine. The tension between us thick and undeniable. We sat close on the couch, his nervous laughter giving way to something more serious as I leaned in, my lips brushing against his. He froze for a moment, unsure, but then I kissed him again, deeper this time, his hands instinctively resting on my hips as the moment took hold of us. I stood, taking his hand, leading him to the bedroom without a word. He followed, wide-eyed and hesitant, but I could feel the excitement radiating from him. Once inside, I pushed him gently onto the bed, climbing over him, straddling his waist as I unbuttoned his shirt. His breath quickened as my fingers slid across his chest, tracing the lines of his muscles. He looked up at me, desire mixed with confusion, but he didn't resist. My lips found his neck, kissing, biting softly, feeling him tense beneath me as I continued to explore his body, unraveling the distance that had always been between us. His hands finally came alive, gripping my waist as I moved against him, our breaths mingling in the silence of the room. I could feel the need in him, the way his body responded to every touch, every kiss. The wine, the dress, the secrecy, it all faded away until it was just us. Tangled in the sheets, our bodies finding a rhythm. A desperate dance that had no words, only sensation as we made love under the dim light, our world collapsing into this one night. I reached out to Jake, pretending to be scared and confused. I told him I was pregnant and that I thought the baby might be his. The look on his face when I told him, it haunts me. He looked so surprised, so hopeful. He asked if I was sure, and I lied. I told him I wasn't completely sure, but that it was possible. He believed me, and that's when I knew I had him. As the months passed, I could see the excitement building in Jake. He was planning for the future, talking about us becoming a family, and I hated myself more with each passing day. But I couldn't stop. I had already set the lie in motion, and now I had to see it through. The guilt was unbearable, but I kept telling myself it was for the best. Then, everything fell apart. Lucas found out about the pregnancy. He confronted me one night, asking if the baby was his. I tried to lie, but the look in his eyes, he knew. I broke down, confessing everything. Lucas was furious. He told me he never wanted to see me again and that I had ruined everything. My heart shattered into a million pieces. I had lost him, and now I was trapped in this lie with Jake. To make matters worse, Jake's family found out about the pregnancy. They were overjoyed, planning baby showers and talking about the future. I could barely look them in the eye, knowing that I was deceiving them all, but it was too late to turn back now. The day the baby was born was the day the truth finally came out. Jake had insisted on a paternity test, just to be sure. I had hoped, prayed even that the baby would look like him, that maybe fate would save me from my own mistakes. But fate wasn't on my side. The test came back and it was undeniable. Jake wasn't the father. The look on his face when he found out, my heart broke for him. He was devastated, confused and hurt. He couldn't understand why I had lied, why I had made him believe the baby was his. He walked away without a word, and I knew I had lost him too. My family disowned me when they found out the truth. My brother Dave, the one person I thought would always be there for me, told me he never wanted to see me again. He couldn't believe I had lied to everyone, especially Jake, and dragged them all into my mess. My parents were ashamed, embarrassed by my actions, and I was left completely alone. Now, I sit here with my baby in my arms, wondering how everything went so wrong. I wanted love, security, and a way out of my mistakes, but instead, I've lost everything. I look into my daughter's eyes and see the innocence there, and it kills me to know that I've brought her into a world built on lies. I made so many mistakes, and now I have to live with the consequences. I thought I could manipulate my way out of the situation, but in the end, the truth always finds a way to come out. And when it does, it's like a tidal wave, sweeping away everything in its path. I wanted love, but what I found was heartache. I wanted security, but what I got was isolation. I wanted to avoid my regrets, but now they haunt me every day. My heart aches for the family I've lost, for the love I'll never have with Lucas, and for the life I could have had if only I had been honest from the start. This is my story, my mistake, and now I have to find a way to live with it.